This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the Oliver Wight website at the conclusion of the webinar. For those of you who participated in our pre-webinar survey, thank you very much. We hope that you're enjoying your complimentary book. A little bit about Oliver Wight. Oliver Wight is a global team of seasoned business improvement specialists with broad industry experience who are committed to helping their clients achieve their business goals. We realize sustainable business improvement can only be achieved by your own people. So unlike other consultancy firms, Oliver Wight transfers to its clients their knowledge of best practices across a range of disciplines and how to apply those best practices in the workplace. Now, an overview of our speakers today. We truly have a global team presenting to you today with Tim Ryer from our Americas organization and Jerry Shanahan from our EAME organization. First, a little bit about Tim. Tim has extensive experience in the product as well as the demand sides of business and is a certified instructor for the Oliver Wight Demand Management Public Course. Tim has over 25 years of industry experience across a broad range of functions, including product management, sales and account management, sales operations, data warehouse systems, and customer relationship management improvement initiatives. Tim provides education, coaching, and mentoring services to many clients across a range of industries, including consumer packaged goods, pharmaceuticals, and technology. Our other speaker today is Jerry Shanahan. Jerry is a proven practitioner with over 20 years of industry experience who leverages his experience to deliver business excellence and to educate and coach organizations on how to achieve their ambitions. He works with many companies across a range of industries, including pharmaceutical, medical devices, food and beverage, and engineering. His programs to date range from integrated business planning implementations to building end-to-end supply chain capabilities to supporting organizations design a truly integrated product and portfolio optimization process. Common thread through all of Jerry's programs is strategy, ensuring every business has a clear view of where they want to go before they deploy the mechanisms to get there. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Tim Ryer. Tim?
Thank you, Todd, and thank you everybody for joining the webinar today. Both Jerry and I have extensive experience working with companies and clients implementing not only an integrated business planning process, but also the product and portfolio process elements that we're going to be discussing today. And to be honest, it's an area that we really observe companies struggling with. And so as we talk through these topics, we're going to focus on some of the key areas where we see companies struggling. And if you feel like you're struggling with some of these, know that you're not alone. It's very common in industry today. And then we'll offer some solutions. Of course, we have limited time during today's webinar, so we'll touch on some of those important topics. But again, the white paper that Jerry and I have authored goes into much more detail in some of the topics that we'll be covering today. So you're certainly able to download that white paper and read it. And Todd will revisit questions at the end. You can ask questions, and certainly even after the webinar, if you have questions about any of the content today, we're happy to answer those. These are topics that both Jerry and I are very passionate about. So before we get to that, though, Todd had mentioned, and thanks to everybody who participated in the pre-webinar survey, what you're looking at right now are the results of that survey. And very interesting to us, fairly typical in what we might expect, although there may have been a few surprises. I want to highlight just a few things on here. I'll take you through some of the results. One of the questions, if you remember, was, are new product plans integrated into your demand plan? And when we say demand plan, we're talking about the official forecast of the company. 63% of you said yes, but also a very significant 37% of you said no, meaning you have project plans in place, but you may not be assuming them in your official forecast of the company. And of that 63%, of course, we don't know to what level of efficiency or effectiveness those assumptions are in play. The next question was, what percentage of your new products which enter the project pipeline actually get launched? And this is actually fairly typical. Very few of you said 100%, and we would expect that, of course. A lot of times, as a project is worked on, many things that develop that are unanticipated. And so we have reasons to cancel projects or never bring them to market or never launch them. And in fact, the ability to kill projects and not bring them to market when when appropriate is actually a measurement of process health when it comes to product and portfolio management. So actually, approximately 30% of you said less than half projects make it to market, and you can see the rest of the results listed here. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see the next question: how well is your new product consensus communicated to the rest of the organization? And I think what is the interesting takeaway here is 63% of you, rather than choosing we rarely reach consensus, did choose communication, but it is ineffective. And I'd just like to point out that doesn't mean that we're not communicating. It can also mean that the appropriate people aren't listening, or that the processes aren't in place in order for that communication to be effective. And then 27% of you said that communication regularly takes place through the integrated business planning, or SNOP, often referred to as sales and operations planning process. Finally, I think the last two results here are very interesting. And the first one here is: how far out does your company's forward-looking view of new product plans extend? And a fairly significant percentage of you chose 12 to 24 months, or even 24 to 36 months. 18% of you said more than 36 months out. So this is a very interesting result. It could also be the measurement of how long it takes simply to complete a project. But on the surface, that sounds pretty far-reaching and fairly good. However, when we compare that to the next question over here in the lower right-hand corner, how far out is your company able to anticipate project resource requirements, such as the hiring of people, engineers, R&D, technicians, so on, we tend to be a little more close in. More than half of you said we're in crisis mode, or hiring people yesterday, or adding resources yesterday, or we can anticipate to hire people up to 3 months out. So most of us realize in order to do an effective job of this, it really takes more time than typically 3 months to identify and implement those types of resources, and then certainly to train them. A fairly significant number of you did say that we can anticipate that up to 12 months out, but still there's an interesting disconnect between these two questions as far as how far out we look and how far out we can anticipate those resources. And so I just would like to bring that to your attention, and we're going to revisit this sort of disconnect later in the webinar. All right, so what we're going to be talking today is specifically the product management, or product and portfolio process. And one of the, we've got a list of symptoms here that are typical of poor product integration into a business, into integrated business planning. And of course, the first typical symptom is poor on-time launch performance for new products. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, and what we're referring to here is we plan to launch products, but we often don't launch them when we planned. And I have seen companies who come fairly close to this, perhaps within a few months, but then it can range as far as 3, 6, even a year late when it comes to launching new products into the portfolio. Another very common symptom is sales not meeting expected demand, and this is due to a lack of integration. A lot of times we hear comments from the sales organization: we had no say, we had no voice, we never agreed to that. There's lots of reasons why we may not be meeting that demand, or we may be overestimating the expectations there. So as a result of those first two bullets, we have a lot of second guessing, which can create additional dysfunctional behavior within a business. There's often a disconnect of product development from the reality of the marketplace, meaning we're assuming, or we have expectations in our portfolio, and really there's no demand or need in the marketplace that's aligned with that. Lack of long-term planning is something that we're going to talk about. It's hard to do within companies, but it's important that we address it. And then another very common symptom is crisis mode resource management. In other words, hiring people yesterday. That was a question in our survey. Fairly significant number of you said yes, that's in fact how we do manage our resources, and I would just suggest it's very common what we see in industry today. And then lastly, another key symptom is project management lacks necessary detail. And what's interesting about that bullet point is it may be that we're requiring too much detail, and that in itself becomes a barrier to getting any detail. And so the important point there is we need to understand and define the right level of detail and just recognize the farther out we go in time, the more uncertainty we have in the plan and the less detail we're likely to have. So these are common problems within integrated business planning and product and portfolio management. The solution is around better and practical integration today, into the process, and today we'll explore some key topics on how to more effectively do that.
Okay, thanks Tim. And Jerry here. So let's take a minute or two and maybe just put this product management in context. So when we talk about integration, as we're going to be talking a lot over the next hour about, then we need to refer to the proven process of integrated business planning. This process has been delivering incredible success for companies for over a decade now at this point. The high-level process associated with IBP is shown on your screen there. And I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with this IBP 5-step process, but maybe just to take a quick summary, we start with the product step. This is where we get the latest perspective on all the activities we're working on to influence our future plans. This essentially is where we manage our product portfolio. That then feeds to the demand step. This is where we roll up our best view of the future demand plan, both in volume and financial terms, and compare it against the top-down expectations as we have set out in our strategic and business plans. Following on from that, we have the supply step, where we are looking to understand what resources and capability we need to position to ensure we can meet the requirements of the unconstrained demand plan. Then we have a very important step called the integrated reconciliation. As you will see from the diagram, this step is a process sweeping through all the other steps as well as a review. And essentially this is the glue that pulls all the required integration points together and allows a clear projection of the future business to be prepared to be reviewed at the final step, which is the management business review. And this is essentially where the leadership team of the particular business entity make key decisions to positively impact the desired outcome for the future in line with the strategic plan for the business. However, what is significant in the context of the topic today is that the first step of the IBP process is the product management step. Why is it significant that this is the first step? Well, all subsequent steps have a direct dependency on the information that is provided from the product step. Without an understanding of the latest status of the product-related projects, how can we create a demand plan that allows us to credibly project revenue and margin? And for supply, how can we know what capacity and material are required and in what timeframes? Ultimately, by the time we get to the management business review, the decision-making is going to be less than optimal if the product information is not effectively integrated. We'll return to this topic of decision-making later in the webinar because this is really important. In particular, though, as it relates to the webinar today, we should note that the product step feeds the demand step in the IBP sequence. Another way of thinking about this is that the demand step effectively integrates in product in the IBP cycle. Therefore, this link between product and demand had better be very well defined. That's the key challenge we want to talk to you all about today. Back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Jerry. And we're going to take just a few minutes and discuss in more depth about that link between the product management review and the demand review. And the first step is to define what the goal of that demand review is, which is to align or reach consensus on what we call a demand plan. Notice we don't call it a forecast. In fact, if you work with Oliver Wight principles in implementing these processes in your company, you will hear us almost fall over ourselves avoiding the use of the word forecast. And the reason for that is the forecast implies or connotes a lack of control, something that cannot be predicted with a high degree of accuracy. And that's something that we might think about with the weather. We cannot determine or influence whether or not it's going to rain or snow or be warm or cold next week, several weeks from now, certainly a year from now. And so all we're left with is forecasting what we think may or may not happen. A plan, on the other hand, denotes action planned in advance, which means someone is determining and controlling actions taken. We have the ability to influence our future. And the point that we want to make here is, in the business world, we are not simply held hostage to a forecast. We have the ability to plan, and we need to plan those influences or our ability to influence our future. And so the words demand plan surround that expectation that we have the ability to influence our future. And so that's how we want to make sure that we understand the goal of that demand review is to reach consensus on a demand plan rather than just a forecast. Another key element of this and key integration point between the demand review and the product management review is defining what portion of that demand plan is in fact new. So in this representation that you're looking at here, you see a chart that represents a forward-looking, what we would consider to be best practice 24-month demand plan. The red bars represent the base products in that demand plan, and then the blue tips on the bars that you see starting approximately 9-12 months out and then extending out and growing, that's the portion of the demand plan that is what we would define as new. This is a very healthy looking profile. You will notice that in this particular product family example, we have healthy new product growth. Certainly not every product family would be represented this way within your business, but if there is the expectation that we're growing with new products, this looks very healthy. It's also important to point out that it is not up to the product and portfolio process to determine this. The numbers and the timing actually get set in the demand review, but it is incumbent upon us in product and portfolio management to communicate those assumptions and assign those expectations. And then the other key part of this is we need to have a clear definition of what is new. And we would just like to encourage people to think beyond SKU. A lot of times we run into companies where it's very easy. If it's a new SKU, it's new. And so the problem with that is new SKUs can include things like label changes, changes in fills, very inconsequential modifications to a product requires us to generate a SKU, but we haven't really consumed any product development or R&D resources. And so we would just encourage you to ask that question. Does the new product consume those types of resources? That's a good way to determine or help augment your definition of what truly is new. And we'll spend some time today talking about how we manage those resources. And then, of course, once we have those plans in place, they need to be shared throughout the IBP process. That's the only way we achieve consensus and integration, is making sure that these plans are transparent and we have the ability to align on them. And so we have this linkage in place between the product management review and the demand review. And so we manage the projects, we manage the resources, we report on those and gain alignment in the product management review. We hand those off to demand, and there's alignment there between those expectations in the PMR and then what we are assuming in the demand review. This is an area that can be tricky. There's a lot of assumptions there, and that's why we would like to be talking about those today. One thing that we need to consider also is when we add new products to the portfolio or we increase our expectations, those are linked to the demand review, and there should be a corresponding increase there as well. So an example of behavior that we commonly see is we are spending time and money and resources developing a new product, but we are not assuming it in the demand plan because we don't know enough about it yet. And what we're going to suggest to you today is you need to find a way to represent it in the demand plan anyway. If you don't do it, somebody else will at a strategic level, And it's more effective to have people closer to these processes building those assumptions. In the same way, if we lower our expectations in the product management review, there also needs to be a corresponding adjustment in the demand review. I can't emphasize this enough, and we'll revisit this at the end of the webinar, but this is best practice, and if you don't establish this type of linkage, you're cheating the business out of understanding the benefits and consequences to decisions that are being made in the product management review. And so just revisiting that concept about demand plan versus forecast, best practice also from a demand planning perspective is to rely on what we would call multiple views. And so you're looking at some good examples of forecast inputs into the demand planning process. A statistical forecast, we're perfectly content to refer to that as a forecast, but notice also there is a product and portfolio input, and that is in fact the output from the PMR into the demand plan. All of these inputs in relationship together can be forecasts that are inputs into the final output of the demand review, which is the demand plan. And where we're focusing today is on that one key input from the product management review.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So, when considering the link that drives the integration between product and demand, then at a practical level, the key vehicle for enabling this is what we call the new product master plan. So what is this new product master plan? Well, as the diagram shows that's on your screen there, at a minimum, it is a listing of all the approved product-related projects that we're working on. In reality, it is much more than this. What you're seeing on the screen is just a summary position, really, that could be fed into the product management review with some very useful information like the latest status on timing, expected revenue, overall demonstrated performance. However, we prefer to think about the new product master plan as a database of information that is required to drive integration and, in IBP terms, ensure the one set of numbers and one aligned plan is achieved over that IBP horizon. And this horizon point is important because, as we know, product plans will typically extend over the full strategic planning horizon. So typically for many companies this will be a minimum of 5 years, extending to 10 years actually for a lot of companies, and even beyond that. However, what is key for the new product master plan is that it contains the right information to allow true integration over the IBP horizon, and that is typically 24 to 36 months depending on the type of business that you're in. And when we talk about this right information, this includes items such as gate milestones, launch dates. If you happen to be in the healthcare environment, it can be things like clinical trial completions, planned clinical trial completions, regulatory approvals by the various countries as we launch products out over time. It can be about site selection if we've got multiple sites for a particular new product. And when we think about the financial aspects, it can be standard costs, margins, revenues, etc. Essentially, all the information required to drive the integration between product and demand needs to be contained in this new products database. So as we move to the next slide, we ask the question, well, how does this new products master plan get updated and how often? Well, in the context of IBP, the new product master plan must be updated every month because, as we know, IBP operates on a monthly drumbeat. This is often a point of debate with companies when designing their IBP process. As Oliver Wight consultants, we regularly get asked, do we really need a monthly update? Would quarterly not be sufficient? And for those of you attending this webinar who have this question on your mind, our experience is that there is enough activity regardless of industry sector that monthly is the right frequency for updating your new product master plan. However, keep in mind that it is only about understanding what has changed. Some questions to ask yourself when updating the new product master plan on a monthly basis are shown on your screen there now. Looking at the projects, are there any new product launches that are delayed? Are there any new product launches that have been accelerated? Are there any on hold or have been killed since the last cycle? Are there any changes in the portfolio, like end-of-life plans for the existing portfolio? Very importantly, what is our demonstrated success rate in launching new products, and is the demand plan aligned? Do product launches hold their estimate of projected revenues? Did that continue to be as was projected at the previous month? Do projects typically launch on time? These questions are a good example of the type of questions a demand manager might be asking a product manager to ensure all the right information is flowing to enable the integration in the IBP cycle. But note that these plans, of course, are all about the future. So in particular, when you look at the last few bullet points there, the key message is that we need to plan based on demonstrated performance. This will ensure that the plans are realistic. This means we have to move from the typically aspirational plans that exist for new products and maintain a reality check based on how we have demonstrated our capability and performance in the past. This is a fundamental principle within IBP of planning based on demonstrated performance. So as we move on to the next slide, we do start to acknowledge some of the practical challenges with maintaining the new product master plan. So when we are creating this new product master plan, of course we need to recognize that because we are dealing with new products, we're looking out into the future, then by their nature, there are going to be a lot of uncertainties. As shown on this slide, for example, as is typical, there will be attrition. Not every project that enters at stage 1 will make it all the way through the staging gate process and ultimately to the market. Some projects will be more strategic than others. Some will have a bigger impact than others, as depicted by the size of the light bulbs in the diagram on your screens there. There may be some information that is not available or that the product teams are unsure of at a point in time. However, the key message that we want to leave you with today is that despite all this ambiguity, there can never be an excuse for not populating the new product master plan. Sure, the product team may have to make some assumptions. However, if they do not populate with their best view on the required information, then they are essentially leaving it up to demand and supply to second guess or come up with their own interpretation. Once this happens, then very quickly we lose the opportunity of having one set of numbers and one aligned plan. Essentially, in that environment, there is no integration. And as the next slide shows, at any given point in time, a company will typically be managing a whole range of new product projects, ultimately looking to deliver the strategic product roadmap for the company. A key requirement of effective product portfolio management is that the profile of the projects being worked on matches the strategic plan for the business. So for instance, if the strategic plan requires exponential growth, then we should be able to see the product projects we are working on that are going to deliver that growth. However, when it comes to product integration, it does not matter if the product is the next blockbuster solution in the market and it's new to the world, or it's a value engineering project that is looking to maintain margins as a product reaches the end of its life cycle. All have to be populated in the new product master plan, and all the fields have to be populated over the IBP horizon. So as we move on to the next slide, we explore why do we then need such tight integration between product and demand? So why ultimately do we need this very tight linkage between product and demand? Well, essentially, it's about effective decision making. If we take the demand step, for instance, when considering the revenue plan, this is critical for all companies, and in the case of publicly traded companies, the predictability of this future revenue plan can have a direct impact on the company's share price. In IBP, the bottom-up financial view of the demand plan is compared against the top-down business plan expectations. If there is a gap between these two views, then as the diagram shows, there are decisions that need to be made on how to close this gap. However, as we move on to the next slide, we can see that if the planned revenue associated with the new products, which are planned to be launched in the IBP horizon, are not considered, then we are missing a piece of the equation. the piece shown in blue in the diagram coming from the new products master plan database in the diagram on your screens. If this is not effectively integrated, then the gap that is made visible is not correct. This in turn will lead to flawed decision making and ultimately will undermine the credibility of the IBP process. This again is why it is so fundamental to have good integration between product and demand. Back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Jerry. And so as we just were reviewing, it's very critical and important to have these projects and these new product launches planned in our portfolio throughout the entire 24 to 36 month planning horizon. And so there's challenges surrounding how we do that, but another area that we see companies struggle with, which goes along with that, is planning the resources to deliver those projects. And so what you're looking at here in this representation is an example of how you could track and review this in a product management review. And if you haven't figured out or haven't approached reviewing the data in this way, I would encourage you to take a look at this example and try and replicate it in your own business. In this chart, what we're looking at is a set of blue bars, and they represent demand on our project management resources. And these resources, as we've talked about before, could be any resource required to develop and launch new products. They could be R&D resources, they could be engineering resources, they could be technicians in the lab, they could even be critical analytical equipment or other areas of capital equipment required to deliver these projects. And then what we see up here is a representation of capacity. And so if we have a number of engineers, the engineers are able to work on projects so many hours per month, we're going to assume what that capacity is and then represent it in a chart like this. The example that we're looking at, we chose intentionally because it is a good example of a bad process. And I would also bring you back to the survey question. If you remember when we first started the webinar, I said there's a disconnect between those two questions. There's a question about, yes, we are planning new products long term, but we're also hiring and adding people into crisis mode. Those two scenarios, those two situations happen directly as a result of what you're looking at here. And so what we see is, yes, in fact, we are planning projects, but it drops off over time. And so out here in the future, we have this gap between demand on our project resources and our capacity to deliver them. We see this very often in companies today, and we ask them, are you going to reduce your resources, or are you going to let people go because you no longer have the need for them out here? The answer almost always is, well, no, of course we're going to be having projects out this far in the horizon. We just don't know what they are yet. That idea, that lack of expectation of knowing what they are, causes this bow wave that we see in the short term. So things get drawn in last minute that we cannot anticipate, and now we have this situation in the short term where we're exceeding that capacity against those resources. People are running around in crisis mode, and we need to hire people yesterday. I would also suggest when adding people and resources, you have a much better opportunity to get those resources approved if you can plan them 6, 12, 36 months out into the future, and you're not seeing that here. If we allow people to have the time to thoroughly vet the decisions and not feel like we're in crisis mode, companies are much more successful at getting those approved. And so there's the classic bow wave effect that we were just talking about, and we have this unknown out into the future as far as people, equipment, and facilities. So the next example that you're looking at here is an example of a healthy resource plan. So now we also have a representation of demonstrated and maximum capacity for those resources to deliver, but we have a project plan in place that estimates far out into the future what the demand on those resources is going to be. And so you notice out into the future, now we are predicting that we're going to need to add more resources, whether it be equipment, people, a whole variety of resources that require to deliver these products on time. We're anticipating those needs now, And then we can ask the question, do we need to add them? We have time to vet those questions and to thoroughly understand them. We know that this is challenging. A lot easier to represent it here in a chart than to actually implement it in your business. The reason that it's challenging is because we have lots of questions about what the detail of this is. I would just simply offer, if we don't answer those questions and assume those projects this far out into the future and include those performance measures that Jerry represented, that include things like what's our attrition rate, how many projects do we typically launch. If our launch success rate is 50% and we have 4 projects in the pipeline, then we need to assume those into the resource plan and work those. So this is an example of a healthy plan. You might also notice we have a gap to capacity here in the middle in this example. And so we actually have the freedom to move these projects around a little bit and pull some out of the future and into the midterm of this planning horizon to help balance those resources and plan them out into the future. Okay? So why do we avoid doing this? I already hinted at this earlier on the last slide. The first and most important reason we see this happening is we make it too complicated. And I would just share with all of you, here we are today on a webinar. We're probably all sitting on computers. We all are very accustomed to using Microsoft Office and Excel and Microsoft Project, and these are very detailed tools. And our world is becoming more detailed and more technical every single day, and we all know this. These tools function in precision. As we get far out into the future, we try and replicate that precision, and we see companies doing this all the time. In order to adequately perform what we saw in the last chart, it requires a degree of estimating. It almost becomes more of an art than a function or an equation, which is what we often try and turn it into. And so I think it's important to recognize we have to estimate. And that estimation is okay as long as we communicate the assumptions behind those estimates to the rest of the organization and within the PMR and gain consensus on those estimates. And so the barrier to that is making it too complicated. We know the farther out we go, it contains a lot of unknowns. And we do not know how many new products will actually make it to launch. And so we have to make those assumptions. We have to estimate that attrition. There's other questions which you can see listed here. Poor track record of predicting initial volumes. This goes back to those perfect project performance metrics that were summarized on that one slide. And as long as we understand what our performance is on those expectations and then try and communicate those and improve on those and have those expectations as a part of our product plan, or project plan rather, we have a solid plan that we can share with the rest of the organization. A lot of times we don't even know what the product is going to be called. That in itself may sound simple. We certainly don't have SKUs or part numbers. Do not let that become a barrier to assuming those both in the demand plan and the resource requirements plan. And so here we're coming back to that link between our projects, how we roll up those projects and assume them out into the future, what our resources are, and then that corresponding integration to the demand plan. These two things have to be integrated together, and as this little gear graphic sort of implies, as we change over here on the left side, we should see corresponding changes in the demand plan on the right side. Very, very critical, not often well done in businesses today. The reason that this is critical is, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it helps us understand the consequences and benefits to decisions that we are making. And if we don't do this, one of the most common events or occurrences that we see in companies today is there may be, and particularly with publicly traded companies, there could be significant pressure to cut these resources or reduce them and save money in the short term. But if we don't then make a corresponding adjustment in the demand plan, which includes revenue and margin expectations, not just volume and quantities, we just cheated the business out of instantly recognizing the consequences of the decisions they're making in project resource planning. And then likewise, if we do not reflect the increase associated with an increased loading in project management, then we've cheated the business out of understanding the benefits or upside to adding those to our product portfolio or project plan. And so this integration becomes critical, and we want to make sure that everybody understands the expectation should be there, and it's highly appropriate for you to set those expectations within your own organization.
Thanks, Tim. So, at the start of this webinar, Tim talked to the challenges of achieving true product integration. So, let's finish up by highlighting the benefits that companies achieve by actually delivering true integration. So, as you can see on your screens there are many, many benefits to be gained. However, I want to bring your attention to one benefit in particular as highlighted there on your screen now. Product management is all about managing the product portfolio to deliver the top-down strategic product roadmap for the business. For sure, this strategic roadmap is all about growth. I've yet to come across a strategic plan that doesn't talk to growth. So when you have robust processes for managing your product portfolio, and most importantly have it effectively integrated in with demand in the IBP process, then you are in the best position to ensure you deliver your strategy and enable the planned growth. So as well as all the great benefits shown on your screen there, like being market-driven, everyone operating off one set of numbers, reducing costs, etc., there can be nothing more powerful and beneficial for a company than delivering that company's strategy. Making sure there is a robust mechanism in place that integrates product to demand is fundamental to achieving this success. Thank you, and with that I will hand you back to Todd.
Thank you, Jerry. We have a few minutes before the top of the hour to answer any questions that any of you may have. Again, in your GoToWebinar control panel, feel free to type in any questions. Okay, we have one question. Looks like from a service provider. Question is, I'm looking at how to apply the IBP process to the S&OP of a service provider instead of a manufacturer. So any unique considerations within this construct would be appreciated. For example, labor hour units of a service. Jerry, would you want to tackle that question?
Yeah, I mean, we get this type of question a lot in terms of integrated business planning and the different type of environments that it can operate to. So a lot of the core principles associated with IBP and with the key topics we talked about today in terms of product and demand integration are applicable in your traditional manufacturing businesses and your service businesses. And if I look at one of our more unusual clients in that regard that is operating integrated business planning, then we've actually got a police force in the UK who are operating integrated business planning and have achieved a lot of benefit from it, and it was quite staggering even when they implemented IBP and they started to match their demand and supply in particular and saw some of the serious disconnects that they had. It was quite eye-opening for them. So how IBP gets actually implemented is going to be different in every environment because every environment is unique. However, the core principles and a lot of the key concepts that we're talking to you about today are still absolutely applicable in all industries, both manufacturing, service, providers alike.
All right, thank you, Jay. We have another question. In a company with more than 8,000 SKUs, is it important to have this process established for every SKU, or should it be at the family or product level? Tim, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we get a lot. 8,000 SKUs is a lot of SKUs. The important thing is, and one thing we haven't touched on a whole lot during this webinar is managing the entire portfolio. And so a lot of times there's an initiative in place for SKU rationalization or figuring out a way to reduce the number of SKUs. The volume of SKUs, however, should not be a barrier to doing project management. And it is the projects that help us deliver the products to the portfolio. There may be multiple SKUs underneath a particular project. So as a product group, if you will, comes to launch, there may be multiple SKUs that are attached to it. And if we try and track through these examples that we've been showing today in terms of project plans and product launch dates at the SKU level, for companies that are in large SKU environments like the question just described, it becomes overwhelming and cumbersome, and it's another good example of that lack of detail or too much detail becoming a barrier to having the detail that we need. And so the important thing here to recognize is we have projects in place. They deliver these products to the portfolio. We need to have some aggregated way of representing these in such a way that we can cover them both in the product management review and in other parts of the business. And so very common to have that number of SKUs in business today. I think the message that I would like to deliver is don't let that level of detail propagate through all the way out into the process where we have projects that are delivering products 12 and 24 months from now, and we don't know what the SKUs are. And so if we have that expectation that we are going to have SKUs represented that far out, that too in itself becomes a barrier. It gets back to what I was talking about earlier. We have to have the ability to estimate and assume at the product family level. So hopefully that answers that question to some degree. Certainly I'm available later if we need to offer more clarification on that.
Thank you, Tim. Another question came in. What is meant by tier in the master plan? Is this a financial tiering or something else? Jerry?
So in the master planning, again, maybe linking a little bit to the last question as well, when you've got lots of SKUs, then, you know, when you're looking at IBP out over that 24 to 36 month horizon, then it is an aggregated plan that we're looking at. So from a new products point of view, when we're looking at the new product master plan, then typically we are looking at individual projects that are feeding up into various families when it feeds into the overall demand plan. So when we're looking at tiering, we're looking at, you know, different levels of being able to build the hierarchy of our product portfolio. And there can be different dimensions to that hierarchy, whether we're looking at it from a marketing point of view or we're looking at it from a product family point of view, a geographical point of view. There can be different dimensions that we're looking for in terms of how we tier it up ultimately to an overall plan that we can project out over that 24 to 36 months horizon. Because while we're looking at different levels of detail when we're looking at the product perspective, looking at individual product level detail, at the demand, we're rolling up, you know, from a geographical point of view and ultimately up into revenue plans. In supply, we're looking at the sourcing perspective of our various sources of supply. But ultimately, when we get to the MBR, we're talking about a senior level team that want to say, well, how does this all tier up and how does it all roll up into the highest level hierarchy for the business that gives us that projection out over time and ultimately gives us a projected P&L for the business that's a true bottom up. So there are different ways of kind of building that hierarchy and tiering it up depending on which step that you're actually addressing in the IBP cycle.
And one thing I'd like to add to that too, Jerry, if you don't mind, is that level of tiering could actually represent size and impact of the projects in the business. And so what I have seen very effectively used in businesses is we may have tier 1 projects. Those are large projects, big impact. We may only have 1, 2, or 3 of them a year, but the impact on our business and the importance of their success to our plan are large. They could be worth millions and millions of dollars to the forward-looking plan, whereas tier 2 projects might be smaller and we may have more of them, and then tier 3 projects may be those unanticipated things that come in last month and we don't know what they are, but we're just going to plan them. The revenue impact may be low, there's a lot of them. It's helpful sometimes to segregate those projects into a tiered system like that so that we can manage our expectations because those tier 1 projects that are big could also create a heavy draw on our resources, and we know we can only manage a few of them, but it also might be critical to the business's strategic plan to have them. And I saw one business very effectively when they tiered their projects this way and started looking at it, they realized their project plan was completely out of line with their expectations, and they had lots of tier 2 or tier 3 projects. But from a strategic planning perspective, their expectation was to have more of those big projects. And so just representing them that way and understanding what the expected impact is on the business can help us with decision making too.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Back to you, Tim. This is a pretty straightforward question. How often should I restate my long-term demand plan? Should it be once a month, before or after the PMR, or more than once, before or after the demand review?
So great question. We would assume that that demand plan gets reviewed and approved every single month. It may be there, and resist the temptation to do it, say, quarterly or any amount of time less than that. I have seen companies who say, well, not a whole lot changes during this time of the year. Maybe your business is seasonal, and you may have a lot of changes that occur in the spring when, if you're in the agricultural business, and that's when all the planting occurs. And then in the off months, we don't have a lot of changes, so the temptation is let's only review it quarterly. Usually what we see when businesses approach it that way, that they wind up spending more time, and it becomes less efficient, and there's much more ambiguity than we originally anticipate. So we've yet to encounter a company that can convince us that they should do it any less frequently than monthly. Certainly, from an aggregate planning perspective, it shouldn't happen any more frequently than that. That's not to suggest that detailed processes may in fact be functioning daily or weekly, but from an IBP perspective, that demand plan needs to be reviewed and set monthly in concert with the product management review that happens before that with the projects that are feeding to it. And then lastly, I would point out in that representation that we had of multiple view forecasts going into the demand plan, it may be that some of those inputs are not reviewed every single month. Some of those forecasts, like a sales forecast, may in fact be reviewed every month, but we may have a marketing forecast that's only updated several times a year, even though the timing of those different inputs may be on different schedules. The demand plan itself should be reviewed and approved every single month.
All right, thank you, Tim. We get this question quite often. It's around tools. What project management tools do you find most effective for resource planning and project tracking to support the IBP process? Jerry or Tim, do you want to answer that?
Well, I'll maybe kick it off, and Tim, you can jump in as well. The key thing about resource management tools in the product step is around your maturity and your ability to be able to get value out of those tools. So we talk a lot in when we're working with companies to understand initially where they're at, how mature their processes are at, because certainly if you're very low in terms of maturity with the processes that you need to have in place around product management, then actually it can be a failure mode to jump to a resource management tool, and there are lots of tools out there around resource management too soon. And one of the failure modes I quite often see with companies is that they've installed a resource management tool and they've got people logging time to projects, and you know, you can get all sorts of really nice reports from all of these tools, but of course it's very much dependent, like any tool, in terms of the information that goes in terms of the quality of what you get out of it. And if you're very low in maturity in terms of your processes, you're not going to get a lot of value from those tools. So when typically for the companies that we're working with, which we would consider to be, you know, reasonably low in maturity in this whole product management space, then we would start by getting them to understand what are their critical resources that they need to manage, and putting a reasonably simple a resource management system in place that's focusing on those critical resources, that has a prioritization system under projects that allows them to be able to prioritize relative to the strategy under business, because everything associated with resource management can only be executed if you've got a prioritization mechanism that you can apply to that. And once you have that prioritization mechanism in place, you can take any critical resource, whether it be people, whether it be money, whether it be IT, computer time, whatever your critical resource is, you can apply it against that prioritization of projects and start to make some real decisions in your business. Then as you mature, then you can start to maybe extend and start to look at some tools to help support that. And there are lots of tools out there. I mean, the best tools from resource management you typically find in the areas of project management business, like construction industry, where there are lots of resource management tools out there for doing that are quite sophisticated. But for many companies in mainstream industry, when you're building products, then you need to be at a level of maturity to really get the value out of those.
Yeah, and I would just like to echo, I couldn't agree more, Jerry. We see many tragic examples of companies that implement tools to fill a gap because they may have seen an example of processes like the one we just represented, and they go right to the tool as a solution, and then ultimately the tools fail, and we spend a lot of time and money, and they don't deliver the results that we would expect. I would just, that's not to take away the importance and the need of those tools. I would just encourage everybody to map out the business process first, determine what the expectations are and the level of detail that's required. And then even if it's very manual at first, doing this in Excel, sort of wireframing out how these tools are going to function, that is time and energy well spent, because then you're ready, you have a really good idea of what the expectations are on how these tools will perform, and you can then select those tools and configure them in a way that matches the business process. If you don't do that critical first step, then those tools, your business processes tend to take on the sort of out-of-the-box configuration of the tools themselves, and that's exactly backwards, and that is a warning from us. That is formula for disaster. The tools are terrific. Just make sure that you do the due diligence ahead of time in defining the process, and even try it out a few cycles or longer in a very manual process that may be painful for you at first, but I encourage you to do that because it's time and energy well spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Coming close to the top of the hour, we have time for one more question. I just want to let everybody know if we didn't get to answer your questions, we will get to them offline and send you a response. So the last question we have time for today is, do you suggest including non-product projects into the portfolio? For example, internal projects for cost savings, capital, etc., since they consume resources, capital, and time. Tim?
Yeah, excellent question, whoever asked that. And so the reason that that's a good question is we may have what we might consider to be renovation or production efficiency projects that are typically managed within the supply organization. And so those projects can compete with product development or R&D resources. And so what we would suggest that happens is those projects themselves, because they're clearly in the space of supply management and manufacturing efficiency, the projects themselves get reviewed. If we go back to that integrated business planning model, get reviewed during the supply review, but then the total capacity of those resources still at least must be represented, tracked, and assumed in the PMR. So while we may not, in the product management review, be directly responsible for managing those resources, we still need to have an understanding of what they are and what the impact is on the very important R&D and product development resources that we're using to develop those projects. And so I think the short answer to that question is it gets reviewed in detail during the supply review, but we need to be able to aggregate and at least understand the demand on those resources in the product management review and review them there.
All right, thank you, Tim. We're at the top of the hour. I want to thank Tim and Jerry for their time today, as well as everyone who attended the webinar. There will be a short survey that will allow you to provide and make suggestions and recommendations on future webinar topics, as well as the ability to request a 1-hour free consultation from one of the speakers today, so take advantage of that. We will also be emailing you a link with the recorded version of this webinar, so you can feel free to share that internally with your colleagues. Oliver Wight does offer a broad range of education and coaching services. You see some of our education classes on your screen today. Additionally, if you have any further questions, please feel free to call the number that will be coming onto your screen if you have any questions, or feel free to visit our website. And I want to thank everyone again for attending the webinar, and have a great rest of your day. That concludes the webinar. Thank you.